Welcome to an episode of Book Drops. I am Don Boozer, the coordinator of the House Center for the Book and the manager of the literature department here at Cleveland Public Library. And I am joined by a returning co-host today.
Hi, I'm Mike Deneen. I'm the Public Service Associate at the wonderful new Huff campus here at Cleveland Public Library.
And today's episode, we are going to be welcoming opening day of the baseball season. And it's appropriate that Mike is here with us because the Huff branch just happens to be right across the street from League Park. So we have some baseball history, and we're going to touch on some of that. We're going to talk about some books, a little bit of baseball history in Cleveland, and also talk about some of the resources at our Sports Research Center as well. So we'll be talking about that as well. So Mike, what can you tell us about baseball?
Well, taking you all out to the ballpark, but first I just want to point out that I work at the new Huff campus, which is part of, I don't know if you've touched on it here at the Book Drops, but there's a very ambitious plan, the facility master plan, where Cleveland Public Library is rebuilding or renovating all 27 neighborhood branches. And Huff, where I work, just happens to be one of the first ones that was rebuilt. We used to be located over by East 89th, further east, but we moved to a new location, which does happen to be catty corner from League Park. And that's kind of what triggered the interest in League Park and why I'm here today. But it's something just for your viewers to keep in mind. The new libraries are being redone with the idea of being more inviting spaces. For example, at Huff, we now have 6 meeting rooms. We used to have just one, and some are very large. We have a number of community groups come in, use the spaces. We're really putting an emphasis here at CPL of being a gathering place for these neighborhoods, because we're in every neighborhood of Cleveland. We got 27 locations around the city. And there was a levy passed in 2017 to fund this, and we've been moving forward. The first batch is finishing up now, and there's more coming in the future. So keep an eye on that. Keep watching cpl.org for information on these new branches.
Yes, indeed.
Also, I'm going to be showing off some items here today. And as I pointed out last time I was here, if you live anywhere across northern Ohio, the materials you see here today are available not just at Cleveland Public Library, but through the CleveNet system. CleveNet is a consortium of 45 different library systems, Cleveland being the largest of which, throughout northeast and northern Ohio. If you see an item here and they do not have it at your library, it can be requested. You can pick it up at your library. It takes about a week or so, depending on where you are, to get it. And you can enjoy these materials, wherever you are. You can be in Sandusky or Girard, Ohio, or wherever. So it's a really fantastic program that CPL started in 1982. It started with just 2 Cleveland Heights in Cleveland, and it's grown to 45. And we have a new man, Jamie, who's, I'm sure, going to grow that even more here in the future. So that's little things to know. And then also, some of the resources we're seeing today, as Don mentioned, from the Sports Research Center, which is here downtown Cleveland. If you ever come downtown, let's say to go to a game, the downtown library is open Monday through Saturday, every day but Sunday from 10 to 6. So if you come down here for a day game or maybe for a night game, they have a treasure trove of mementos and books and all sorts of materials.
Archival materials.
Yes, archival material of baseball history. I highly suggest, if you're a fan of that sort of thing, come check it out. So, like I said, the library is a wonderful resource for this stuff, both downtown here for some of these mementos and things you can pick up at your local branch. So mainly I want to be here. There's so much, you talk about baseball history, but League Park specifically is kind of why we're here, and that's kind of a
And I will admit too that I'm not a big baseball fan or sports fan, but I am absolutely fascinated by the history of baseball, especially after being out at League Park and stuff. It's amazing the way that baseball is sort of interwoven into the history of the area and the United States, for that matter.
Yes, that's true, because I think baseball, to be honest, is not as big a deal as it used to be. I think it was, even by the time I was a child, football had outgrown it by leaps and bounds. I think basketball has done the same by now. We're filming this on the first day of the college basketball tournament, and people are at sports bars enjoying that as we speak. But baseball has a unique position, and we'll touch on some of these books here, in terms of labor relations, race relations, just the history of the country, the shifts of population. A lot of that's reflected because baseball is so much older and was so much more important earlier on in
Right.
the early 20th century. It reflected the culture more, and you see the changes in that game, and it shows up in our art and in our books. You know, not just, I'm going to show a lot of nonfiction items here, historical stuff, but we'll talk some about some of the fictional, novels and movies and things, not historical, that are inspired by baseball, and that's unique. There's more baseball movies and more baseball songs and
Yeah.
mentions, compared to other sports, especially historically. So we'll touch on some of that. But League Park, it was first founded in 1891, and it's located in Huff, at the corner of 66th and Lexington. And you might wonder why there, because here in the 21st century, people tend to associate when new facilities are built, and they're talking about a Brown Stadium again now. They tend to build things downtown because you're looking for heavy government funding and you want to maybe energize an area or put it in a hub of population. Back in the days of 19th century baseball, basically the baseball owners just had to pay for their own fields, and so they would find a lot of land they could find, and preferably somewhere along a streetcar line, whether it be here or New York or somewhere where people could, because automobiles were not a thing yet. You want to be somewhere where people could get to the park. And Frank Robeson, who owned what was the Cleveland team, I think they were the Spiders at the time. They were in the American Association, which was called the Beer and Whiskey League derisively. It was a rival league of the National League, which was the National League still exists, and that started in 1876. American Association, one of the first upstart rivals of it. Cleveland was in that league, and Robeson happened to control a lot of the streetcars in Cleveland, and one of his lines went right down Lexington Avenue. So naturally, he had an extra incentive to locate the ballpark at
Look at
66
this,
in Lexington.
open land. Look at that.
Exactly. So, and that's true of a lot of the teams from that era. What we now know as the St. Louis Cardinals, they used to be called the Browns way back in 1880s. They were started not by Anheuser-Busch, but a different brewer started them, and as a mechanism to sell beer at the games. So the baseball wasn't necessarily seen as a big moneymaker itself, but a lot of times these teams were started as ways to enhance revenue for other businesses. So that shows how much it's grown in the last 150 some odd years. So anyway, that site was selected, and the ballpark itself, and it still exists, the field itself has been restored to this day, although now with artificial turf as opposed to grass, but the field itself is the same dimensions now. It's been restored. And like all the ballparks of that time, it had odd dimensions. Something charming about baseballs compared to the other sports is every baseball field can have different odd dimensions, have a deeper left field, a deeper right field, or whatever. And a lot of times that's just a byproduct of where these parks were located. Because in the case of League Park, Lexington Boulevard, Lexington Avenue runs right behind the center field fence there, or the right field fence actually. So you couldn't put more right field there. So we had a short right field fence, which would become important later on when the fellow named Babe Ruth started playing. So you would have these odd dimensions. In Boston, it's just the way around. There you have the left field seat at Fenway is short. And this is just a byproduct of where the streets were and how you had to squeeze these fields into these blocks. Nowadays, well, especially in the 70s, the 60s and 70s, they started building the multi-purpose stadiums, and they were like very symmetrical and round and, perfect from a utilitarian standpoint, but they were not as aesthetically pleasing because everything was very symmetrical and very boring. Fans not liking that.
And I think you said you were going to touch on too the fact that League Park itself was even a multi-purpose park.
Yes, that would come a little later, but
yeah.
And that was more just by necessity.
Exactly.
These parks in the 70s were designed. By that time, the NFL was a big enough deal that people wanted to have multiple teams. Right. But basically, those teams became derided for being too sterile, and now beginning with the ballpark here, the former Jacobs Field, Progressive Field, in Baltimore also, they started putting weird quirks into some of the downtown stadiums to try to make them feel like the old ballparks. So it kind of went full circle there a little bit. But anyway, getting back to League Park, it was put there as in a neighborhood. So Huff has the distinction of being the only neighborhood in Cleveland to really host major professional sports because pretty much, most of the sports either been in Richfield with the old Coliseum or else downtown. Cleveland Arena, sort of borderline. It was near downtown. It's not really a neighborhood. So that's one of the many things that makes our Huff neighborhood unique among Cleveland, because it did host major sports for decades.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was built in 1891. And after a couple of years, the Cleveland joined the National League, the big established league. And there's a whole, you can go to the Sports Research Center, the stories of 19th century baseball and the battle of the different leagues. There was one league started just by the players to try to get better pay, because the owners up until the 1970s could treat the players as poorly as they wanted, because basically they had a lifetime contract that could be renewed. So, there were all sorts of feuding with different rival leagues popping up. And that happened in the 1890s, 1880s, 1890s. So the Cleveland jumped to the National League, which was the main league, and it went to 12 teams. What wound up happening is the owner wound up owning a team in St. Louis and the Cleveland team. And in 1899, he took all the good players and put them all on St. Louis. So the Cleveland team wound up winning like 30 or 40 games. Just became kind of a joke because it was just like a junior varsity team. And the league at that point contracted down to 8 teams. And so Cleveland was kicked out. The owner was happy to keep the team of St. Louis, the Cardinals. And so Cleveland was out of the team. Now, coincidentally, around this time, Van Johnson and Charlie Comiskey and some folks took something called the Western League, which was one of the major minor leagues based in Chicago, and they decided they're going to raise it up to a major league status. And so they became the next rival league, and that became what we now call the American League, which exists to this day.
Wow.
So they started in 1901, and they were known throughout, even into my lifetime. It's kind of called the junior circuit, even though it's 100 years old now. It's still 25 years younger than, the National
It's all
League.
relative, yeah.
Exactly. So Cleveland joined they got a new team in that league, and and they also played there at League Park. Now, one of the distinguishing things, the first game played in 1891 at League Park, going back to the American Association, Cy Young, the one and only, pitched that first game.
Yeah.
So one of the many, many legendary figures who had played there. And, the Cy Young Award named for him, one of the elite pitchers. That's back in the dead Paul era when, the scores were very low. The pitchers could, doctor the ball however they wanted, and the ball was not wound very tight, so it didn't jump off the bat. So it's, the dead ball era. And in the era of dominant pitchers, he was the most dominant. So basically 1901, they joined this American League, and then by 1903, the two leagues are fighting, and they're overpaying their players as far as the owner is concerned. So they decide, okay, we'll call a truce, and we'll have the champions meet in the fall, something called the World Series. That started in 1903 and lasts to this day. So there was peace between, and from that point on, those were the two leagues, and there were no more really. There was one in 1919 that tried to be kind of a rivalry, but it didn't last, or actually 1912, but that didn't last long. It wasn't a Cleveland thing. So anyway, so baseball continues to grow. Mm-hmm. Like most of the stadiums at the time, it was a wooden structure there, the original League Park from 1891. Finally, at 1909, they decided we got to put a concrete and steel. Among other things, a lot of these parks were burning down around the country because, it's just wooden bleachers, wooden building. They're really susceptible. There were a few teams that had their stadiums catch fire during the off-season. Luckily, no sort of catastrophe with a crowd in it. But, the ship was on to, brick and steel stadiums. Right. And this is around the era when League Park was built. In Chicago, there was a park built for the Chicago Whales of that Federal League, one of the rival leagues, and it was built at Clark and Addison. And the National League team wound up taking it over, and that's now called Wrigley Field. That's still there. Comiskey Park was built in Chicago. The aforementioned Comiskey, who started the American League, he built it. So some of what we now know as the modern field started happening, concrete, metal. And so Cleveland went along with that. So that park stood, and by 1920...
give me your League Park book, and I will hold that up as we...
a lot of the information can be found in this gem here, which is available, as I mentioned, through CleveNet. You can pick this up at your local, CPL or CleveNet branch. And it has a treasure trove of knowledge of all sorts of history of League Park, primarily baseball, also other things that went on there. Now, probably the biggest thing that happened at League Park would be the 1920 World Series, the only time the World Series was actually played there. And two things happened that combined for this. Now, you may be aware, even if you're not a baseball fan, you may have heard of something called the Black Sox. In 1919, they were the first team, I'll say, to get caught throwing baseball games, because there are those who believe that the Cubs may have done the same the year before, but that was never proved. But what happened was, and uh, they conspired with gamblers. They lost the World Series. They were heavily favored. They lost the 1990 World Series because they were underpaid. It's a recurring theme for baseball history: the owners exploiting the players. And so to get even and to make extra money, these players, took money from the gamblers, and they wound up getting double crossed in a lot of cases. But they threw the World Series, and it was rumored people sensed something was up. People like Studs Terkel, or people like, I'm sorry, Ring Lardner, and some of the sports writers at the time uh, were kind of sniffing it out, and there were rumors and stuff. And through the 1920 season, Cleveland was playing very well, and they were keeping up with the White Sox, and it was a close race throughout the year. And a couple things happened late in the year. On August 17th, the shortstop for the Indians, his name was Ray Chapman. He was hitting 300, one of their best players. He was struck in the head in New York with a pitch and died well, he didn't die at the game. He died shortly afterwards at the hospital. He became the last player to be killed in the game. It happened in 1920. So this was obviously a big emotional, not only did they lose one of their best players, but they lost a teammate. This became a huge thing. You had a funeral, thousands of people lined the streets of Cleveland, for the procession. He's buried, I believe, at Lakeview Cemetery. So this became a huge thing. And somehow the team were able to rally around that. There's a couple books about this. One, The Pitch That Killed. This kind of goes into detail about that whole season and about, all the story around it, and how the team, they had to rely on younger players to step up and fill that role, and miraculously they did, and they were able to keep up with the White Sox, through the rest of the year. Another book, this was called Do It for Chappie, which became kind of a rallying cry for that time. Again, they were keeping up. It was neck and neck with them and the White Sox down to the last week of the season. And then what happened was, in August, I believe, the president of the Chicago Cubs, his name was Bill Veeck, and he's the father of the more famous Bill Veeck, who would own the White Sox and the Indians later. He found out that one of his players the pitcher was going to throw a game in August. He called in and reported it. And this kind of triggered, so not by design, the Cubs sort of ratted out one of their own players, and this triggered the investigations, which then, by late September, the White Sox were getting found out. And so the story broke the last week of the season, and so they had the White Sox best players all got suspended. So Cleveland won the pennant by 2 games. They got in the World Series, thanks, the nice Hollywood part is, they rallied for Chappie, but on the other hand, because the Black Sox got busted finally, because a lot of people forget, if you see the movie or whatever or you hear the story, people sort of think, oh, the White Sox got caught and they were banned from baseball right away. This took years to unfold, because even after it leaked in 1921, they went to the trial and all that. So, it didn't all happen as quickly as you might think. So anyway, 1920, they go to the World Series. They play Brooklyn, and it's the best-of-9 series. And a couple interesting things happen. One of which is that there's an unassisted triple play in which has not happened since in World Series history. The second baseman, because the shortstop was killed, the second baseman caught a line drive, stepped on the second base and tagged the guy out. So, got an unassisted triple play, fantastic play. They won the series 5-2 over Brooklyn. And that would be Brooklyn's last World Series for a while, until they became sort of the fabled Dodgers that are in popular imagination of the 40s and 50s, the Bums. But was obviously a big event. That was the highlight of Cleveland's time at League Park, that they won that. They happened to beat out also another team that was chasing them was New York, because they had just acquired the disgruntled pitcher from Boston, Babe Ruth, who refused to pitch anymore. So people give Boston heat for selling him, but they sold him for $100,000, which is a ton of money
Oh,
back then.
back then, oh my heavens, yeah.
And he wouldn't pitch. So what good was he? So a pitcher that doesn't pitch, who needs that? So anyway, they beat them out. But then what happened was the Yankees grew stronger. Cleveland didn't get back to the World Series. And there's a few books. Like there's lots and lots of books. Here's one about no money, no beer, no pennants. In the 20s and 30s, the Depression came, and that wasn't good for for any teams in baseball. But especially it just made it hard for people to go to the games and whatnot. So it's hard times all around.
And if I remember correctly, Babe Ruth hit a home run at League Park.
Yes. Well, he hit 46 home runs at League Park.
Oh, well, okay.
He
Well, there
hit
you go.
quite a few. Because one good thing that happened in the 1930s is a young man named Bob Feller, who was 17 years old, had not graduated high school yet. A high school kid from Iowa, was signed under questionable circumstances because they had to go to an arbitration.
Baseball in questionable circumstances seems to be a running
theme. They went to
theme.
an arbitration to determine the legality of his signing, and the league allowed him to stay. He made his debut, 17 years old, and he wanted to become the Hall of Famer Bob Feller. He made his debut at League Park. A few other big milestones. Babe Ruth did hit his 500th home run at League Park. And again, it's at Lexington Avenue behind right field. It's at short right field. They did put to this day, there's still a big tall fence there, but still, a hitter can get it over that. So that happened there. Another famous Yankee, Joe DiMaggio, got his 56th consecutive hit there at League Park. Now, this was during the time the big Cleveland Stadium that many of us remember downtown, that had opened by then. So there was a time when the Indians would play some games that they would play like weekend games, or holidays they'd play at the big stadium, and they'd play the other games at League Park.
Oh, okay.
There was a time when they played both. So he got his 56th hit at League Park one night, and the next day the stadium, the streak was snapped. And then he got 25 more hits in a row after that, or he would have had like 80 hits in a row. So anyway, So that's one of the legendary things that happened there. So I touched on it briefly, but the new stadium, the municipal stadium was built in 1933. It opened. Now, oddly enough, it was not built specifically for the baseball team. Doesn't say build us a stadium. It's not like today where stadiums are built. It was built, and the team still wanted to play at League Park. It's still kind of interesting that they built the stadium. It wasn't built for football. There really wasn't major football yet, but they did play both for a while. And it became gradually, by the 1940s, the park became too old and too hard to keep up. So they eventually, by 1946, they played their last game and moved on.
Yeah.
So, like I said, that thing with DiMaggio happened during the period where they were splitting games between the two, which doesn't really happen anywhere anymore. Teams have one stadium and that's it. So yeah, that's kind of a little timeline. There were other things that happened. There was also boxing and football there at League Park. During the time the Cleveland Rams, we now know them as the Los Angeles Rams, actually started there, and there's a whole story with them. They've got a book on them, and they actually started there. They played at the League Park. They only played their last game ever. They played at the big Cleveland Stadium before they moved, and they got pushed out of town because the Browns were coming. And plus, Los Angeles, they knew there'd be a lot of money there, so that's a pretty good deal. It's a good place to land.
Yep.
And they went from League Park, which I never could get a dollar figure how much League Park cost to build. I'm sure it was in the thousands, the original ballpark. Right. The new SoFi Stadium where the Rams play was $5 billion. So they've upgraded slightly because it's a domed, retractable dome thing with all the bells and whistles and whatnot. So as I mentioned, there's a whole bunch of really good books. Now, another baseball team that played at League Park was the Cleveland Buckeyes. Now, people, if you know American history, civil rights history, baseball history, that there was a separate Negro leagues back in the day because there was an agreement among the owners that there would be no black players. So starting in 1920, there was the Negro leagues played, and Cleveland had a team called the Buckeyes. So they're the Cleveland Buckeyes, and they played and they won the World Series in the Negro League World Series in 1945. And they were part of, here's one of the books kind of covering something called Integrating Cleveland Baseball. And this combines their story with the integration of the Major League team, because the Indians were one of the first teams to have black players after certainly the first team in the American League, and then after the Dodgers, one of the first. So there's a whole cool story there with how that went about. And then eventually they wound up closing in 1950 because basically they were losing their players to the major leagues, so
Right.
it was harder for them to stay in shape. And part of why that happened, and also why the Rams played there, back then, these cities were separately, owned independently. So it was good to have a second team to be there if the major league, if the one team's out of town, you have the other team playing there. So you're using that stadium and getting those concession dollars, getting that rent money. So there would be boxing, there'd be other things. Some of these ballparks, they try to have as many events there as they could. Even if it wore down the field or whatever, they had to pay the bills. They didn't have big TV rights money or whatever coming in. So Larry Doby went on to become a big name. He was the first black player for the Indians, and he also he was the second black manager for the White Sox. So the Indians had the first, Frank Robinson, and he has quite a story. He's the second player and the second manager.
Yeah.
And so he's an impressive figure, back in the day he was well known here in Cleveland, but that's a good story. And then this isn't really Cleveland specific, but there's a really good book about the history of the Negro Leagues. If you're interested in that, it's called Only the Ball Was White, which is one of the great book titles of all time. And that kind of gets into the whole history. It's been about 40 years, from 1920. The last team folded in 1960, the Kansas City Monarchs.
Wow.
And that's the team, I don't know if you saw the Ken Burns baseball. Buck O'Neill, the guy who spoke on there, he was a big horse he was a manager, player, leader of the Monarchs, and that's where the Negro League Museum is today. So that's a big thing in Kansas City, the history of the Monarchs. So we touched on, and that's just some of what we have in the library. Now, we talk about nonfiction books here. There's tons more, because I just kind of focused on the League Park days. There's tons of great books.
We have a vested interest in League Park.
So being from Huff, but we've got books at the CPL if you're interested in the 90s, you're too young to remember those days, you want to learn about those glory days. If you want to learn about the beer night, the beer night fiasco, there's a book called from Dan Coughlin called Pass the Nuts. He has the best written story of that. There's a book about Sam McDowell, who was the player the Indians had in the 60s and 70s. He is the template for Sam Malone from Cheers, because he basically had $1 million arm and a 10-cent head. Because he drank himself out of the baseball. He lived in Cleveland Heights in a double and would throw wild parties and stuff and drink.
Oh my
heavens! He had all the talent in the world, but there's just a book written about him, the saga of Sudden Sam, which I highly recommend. So there's all sorts of great stories, not necessarily the most famous players or the biggest things, but basically they have everything at the Sports Research Center. If you want to know about the golden age of New York baseball, or about those 1890s or whatever, they've got all of it there.
Yep.
So I highly recommend look into it if you come down here in person, or you can go to the CPL website, look on the catalog, and you request items to be sent to your local branch.
We have a couple fiction books?
Yeah, since we're here in the lit department, because in addition to the nonfiction stuff, obviously baseball, since it was so big for so long, has a big impact on our culture, arts. So a lot of fictional books written, and I got a few here. There's countless of them, but some of the most well-known. Here's one, of course.
We encourage you to share your favorite baseball fiction books in the comments as well.
Yeah, comment here with us. But here, a title everybody knows, The Natural. Of course, there's Robert Redford's handsome mug on the cover of this book. But if you read the spoiler alert, if you read this book, it's a little different than what's in the movie. It's just as good, maybe better.
There you
I
go.
highly recommend you could do a whole book drop just on different.
That's a teaser. Yeah.
How books and movies can be different and comparing the two. I mentioned earlier the Black Sox scandal. And the key figure who actually did play in Cleveland for a big part of his career was Shoeless Joe Jackson, and so that became a book by W.P. Kinsella called Shoeless Joe. Yep. Now, that title may not sound as familiar to you, but this became a movie with a little fellow named Kevin Costner, and it was set in Iowa, and it was called Field of Dreams. And so again, uh, this book is more along the line, not as radically different as The Natural, but certainly worth a read.
Yeah.
And that's another one of the things here in the lit department. Also, another one for love of the game, a little less known, but this one, an author I love because I love his historical fiction, Michael Shara. So his final book, this is the last thing he wrote, for love of the game, and this is a fictional story of a major leaguer in the twilight of his career, and I highly recommend that one as well. Also, here in the lit department, we have some of the best sports writing here. People like Ring Lardner, we have compendiums of them here, and some are the journalism stuff. He did quite a bit of writing. His J.D. Salinger and many others have praised his writing. So there's all sorts of great stuff here in the lit department as well. Fictional stuff. So definitely recommend you check that out, and check us out at the library. Come visit us at the Happy Huff branch. Like I said, we're right catty corner from
You can check out the library, check
League
out a
Park.
book, and check out the historic League Park
And
as
I'll
well.
point out, League Park is functioning. The Major League Baseball recently had the All-Star game here, and they've put in lights at League Park, and they're putting a scoreboard in this spring, and there are still high school games being played there on a regular basis. So if you're there, if you come for a game, or there's a museum there called the Baseball Heritage Museum. It moved there in 2014 when the place was refurbished and kind of rebuilt. Definitely come by and see us at the Huff branch. And definitely, if you're downtown for a game, come to the Sports Research Center here at the main Cleveland Public Library.
We mentioned the Cleveland Sports Research Center here at the main library, but I also wanted to call attention to the fact that we have not just archival materials, we also have a number of collections within the Sports Research Center, including an amazing collection of vintage baseball games, as in board games. We have a collection of sheet music that's baseball related, and we have an amazing collection of dime novels from the late 1800s, early 1900s, and some that are even printed in Cleveland. And some of those are available on our digital gallery that is available on our website for everybody to read as well. So come and visit us and find out all that we have to offer. All right, Mike, thank you very much for this fascinating little walk through baseball history, Cleveland history, and a little bit of national history as well. So this has been great. So we are looking forward to opening day, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Book Drops.